We have a very good question that is under consideration. I will read it out, and this will be essentially what our panelists will be responding to. In case you are wondering who could possibly have written this, I'll read the question and then you can all guess. Faith and science are often understood to be in a state of war with each other, sometimes engaging in open battle with each other, and other times submitting to an uneasy, unfulfilling truce. Underlying this perception, of course, is the notion that faith and science are essentially polar opposites on the epistemological spectrum. Scientific truth, according to this viewpoint, requires objective, evidence-based assertions regarding only what is out there, while the truths of faith, that is, truths that are not based directly upon empirical observation, are understood to have their bases in the subjective evaluation of reality pertaining primarily to one's personal life experience. Is the dichotomy presumed to exist here between the perspectives of faith and science valid upon closer scrutiny? Are we merely to content ourselves with the truths, with speaking of the two as the best epistemological complements aimed at different types of knowing within their own spheres, such that the one begins where the other ends? Essentially, there are two main questions here. Can faith ever truly exist outside of the prior and continued exercise of reason? And to what extent are the faith assertions, that is, theories of science, not merely complementary, but essential to the scientific endeavor itself?
Good morning. Is this on? Is it on?
Yes.
Is it on?
I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. These are not my words, but they do express my perspective on the intersection of faith and reason. These are actually the words of Galileo, who I'm sure you've heard of. He was an Italian physicist, mathematician, and astronomer, and a key figure in the scientific revolution. What is Galileo saying? He's emphasizing that it's not rational for humans to forego our ability to explore and understand the physical world using science for the sake of religion. Let's look at a concrete example of how you have used your human sense and intellect to better understand the world around you. Do you remember the first experiment that you did in chemistry when you were sophomores? There's some sophomores there, so it's fresher in your mind. It involved dissolving copper 2 chloride, which is bright blue, in water. And then do you remember what you did? Come on. Is that Audrey? Okay. Crumpled up aluminum foil and put it in, and then made observations. So you and your partner made observations when the two substances came into contact with one another. And based on those observations, you concluded that a chemical reaction had occurred, and a new substance that hadn't existed now was in existence. I actually went back and read some of your lab reports from that experiment, and here's some of the observations you made. One was the temperature of the mixture increased when the foil was added. That's an objective observation. You measured the temperature and you found that it increased. There was no opinion involved in that. Here's another one though. The mixture started out looking pretty, it was blue, and then it became very ugly and it was a muddy green. So obviously subjectivity has crept in here, and from the perspective of the writer, for whatever reason, the blue was superior to the green that it became afterwards. So in science, methodologies are purposely devised to try to keep subjectivity out of the question. Double-blinded studies, for example. This is meant to prevent experimenters from infusing their biases, their beliefs, or even their hopes into the results of an experiment. One of my favorite quotes about science is from Einstein's book on the evolution of physics, and he describes it as a scientist as a person trying to solve a mystery, reading a mystery book, and not being able to skip to the end of the book to find out the ending. The scientist has to actually perform the tedious experiments, collect the data, analyze it in order to determine what the conclusion will be. He adds, though, To obtain even a partial solution to the question at hand, the scientist must collect unordered facts available and make them coherent and understandable by creative thought. So collecting facts is objective, but that last part, making them coherent and understandable, basically answering the so what question, that's where subjectivity comes from. So even though science is supposed to be objective, there's always a constant struggle to keep subjectivity out. But I've personally found the opposite to be difficult as well. I found that in my life, I can't separate the way that my mind thinks as a scientist from my thoughts on faith and religion. So just as Einstein said that a scientist can't skip to the end of a mystery novel and find out what the conclusion would be, we know that we can't theoretically confirm God's existence or nature until we get to the end of our book, the end of our human lives. In truth, a full understanding may not even be possible to the human brain once we start reading about quantum mechanics and realizing that ultimately many things are unknowable. So the objective and subjective observations that we make throughout our lives can help us to build a religious theory. So that's infusing a scientific train of thought into thinking about your faith. So the theory that I build throughout my life based on my observations is what I characterize as my faith. And throughout my life, many of the people that I've respected the most intellectually, the people that I figured if anyone could see through religion as an institution, it would be these people. I've come to find out that many of them are believers, and in many cases Catholics actually. So just to name a few, when I was at a public university, my philosophy professor, I remember being at church on Sunday and looking over and seeing that he was in the pew next to me. And then my research advisor, professor of chemistry at Columbia University, also Catholic. So these are just a couple observations that are in support that are supporting my religious theory, my faith. And so just a final quote to end from a Japanese poet from the 17th century called Matsuo Basho. He said, "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise. Seek what they sought." So don't seek to just model yourself off of somebody. Find somebody who you respect and try to understand what drove them to get where they were, where they are. So this is the mindset that motivates me to always be intellectually and religiously curious, and to feel a sense of urgency to understand and a feeling of ownership over my beliefs. It leads me to collect observations as I travel throughout my life and to use them to inform my religious faith. And then ultimately to know that my faith is what makes me believe that it's worthwhile to try to understand.
Dr. Landry, Danae?
I define faith as a concept or state of mind supported strictly by beliefs, and beliefs cannot be proven wrong or right. They are merely strong ideas that shape an individual's outlook on life. I believe that faith goes as far as what cannot be seen, tested, or proven. I do not think that it needs to be reasoned. It just simply has to be. This is where the line between science and faith is drawn. Science relies on tests and being able to actually see the truth. Science begins where faith ends. In other words, when you can no longer come up with your own ideas and must revert to facts, you must let go of faith and accept proven truths. Faith and science keep each other in check, ensuring that some questions can be answered when others cannot. They are not polar opposites, but rather they work together, picking up where the other leaves off. An example of this could be thinking of the Big Bang Theory, which is a scientific explanation for the Earth and where we are right now. And even if you do think that the Big Bang is something that actually did happen, you also have to think, how did the Big Bang start, and was it God? And this is where faith comes in, and Thomas Aquinas' ideas, which state that you can trace everything back to God. And I remember in my 7th grade religion class, we were talking about the Big Bang Theory, and some of us said that we don't think that God just said poof and Adam and Eve came and there's no evolution. And my religion teacher said, yeah, you can believe in the Big Bang, but then you also have to ask who clapped his hands and made the Big Bang. But sometimes, however, faith and science do not need to exist together, and faith may stand alone. We find this when we examine the idea of suffering. Through faith, we conclude that suffering is a product of God's will, and no science can prove or disprove this. This is where we have to come up with our own explanations, and most times, a definite answer is never reached. And then we can relate this to the story of Job, and the only way for him to understand his suffering was for him to actually question God and try to understand God's actions and what was going on in his life. And God answers him by saying that he really has no answer for Job's suffering. And God is an omniscient and omnipotent God, so we have to be able to use our faith to trust that whatever is happening in our lives is something that is a work of God. And then we can also think of God on trial when names are being called to go into the gas chambers. One of the men said, all we can do now is pray. So even as he was being brought to his doom, all he could do was think of God, and that's an example of strong faith even in a time of suffering. But science is also able to break away from the chain of faith, and it provides a certainty through concrete proof. And we can see this in the lives of atheists who don't really have a God to believe in, but they're able to believe in science. So they use science to answer all their questions rather than reverting to an unknown, omnipotent, or omniscient God. And therefore, when there are no definite answers, faith has to completely take control and work on its own, without science. When there is no faith, science is able to answer all necessary questions. While the two can work together as two pieces of a puzzle, one can work without depending on the other.
Mr. Martone, the author of the question, in case you didn't forget.
So good morning, everybody. This is just a subject that's near to my heart, and something that also I think is very important. It goes to the heart of what a lot of senior seminars about. There are just two concepts, I guess I would say, that I think we should focus on, or at least I would like to focus on: complementarity and awareness of the unknown. Science, from my perspective, is concerned with the how. How many, how much, how does one process lead to another process which affects three other processes. It has to do with quantifying our world. And then making explanations, developing theories to go from there. Theology is concerned with the why. Why am I here? What is the meaning of my life? Why do the innocent suffer? I can't think of a better formulation than that. Science, the how; theology, the why. Within those spheres, I would say both are completely complementary. In fact, it's when theology tries to explain how questions that theology runs into trouble. And when science tries to explain why questions, that's when science runs into trouble. We see this epitomized almost in sometimes the controversy regarding evolution. It's when theologians try to explain, how human beings came into existence. That's where theology kind of is trying to answer a question that's outside of its sphere. And similarly, when science tries to explain, tries to give a meaning to that, to how the evolutionary theory, how that corresponds to a meaning to human existence or a lack of meaning, that's when science runs into trouble. So I think if they stay within their spheres and in communion with each other, there never needs to be any sort of tension between the two. So that's one thing I wanted to say regarding the question, complementarity. The other is the awareness of the unknown. Both faith and science begin and end probably there, in an awareness of the fact that we don't know things. In fact, if we take the opposite of each of those, you'll see that neither faith nor science is responsive or is actually interested in questions that would arise. If I am unaware that I don't know something, if I am unaware of the unknown, I'm not going to be questioning it at all. I have nothing to question. A dog can never be confused about calculus or the theory of relativity. Not because it's so intelligent, of course, but because it could never even know to ask those questions. It doesn't know that it's unaware. And neither faith nor science would have anything to say about that. Neither faith nor science would arise out of an unawareness of the unknown. Similarly, if something is known, if I have an awareness of what is known, then too, neither faith nor science would arise. I have nothing to believe, to need to have faith regarding, or I would not need to try to scientifically understand something if it's already known. You always hear the saying, seeing is believing. It's the exact opposite of that. Seeing is never believing. Seeing is not believing at all. Seeing is knowing. It's when I don't see that I have to believe. It's the awareness of the unknown from which both faith and science arise. When we look at something and don't understand it, we try to do so. And that's where faith or theology comes in, and that's where science comes in also. But implicit to this very recognition of our unawareness of our awareness of the unknown is the fact that reason is involved. It's the fact that my reason doesn't take me to the point where I can know something, that I would need to have some sort of faith, that I need to believe. So reason is directly related to faith. Without reason, faith is just throwing darts. It's not throwing darts at an answer. It has no correlation with reality. Similarly, though, as I would see it, my reason depends on my exercise of faith, of my assumptions about reality. I have a faith in using reason. We are having faith. We are demonstrating a faith that my reason is able to explain something. That logic is able to explain something. That if you ask this is not something I made up or anything. If you ask a scientist, philosopher, and a poet to describe a tree, they'll come up with 3 different descriptions, of course, because they're looking at reality from different interpretive frameworks. If we think similarly of our logic as an interpretive framework, but only an interpretive framework, then we see that there's a faith implicit in that I am believing that this is the way to understand things. Not that it's wrong or it's the best we can do, but I guess it's that openness to the idea that it might not be fully explanatory. But anyway, those are the 2 points I wanted to make regarding the question.
For many people, it is easier to accept the separation of truths between science and faith than to discuss it. We tend to think that debating and disagreeing about where science lies in relation to faith and vice versa is going to create a chasm between these 2 ideas. In reality, though, not spending time evaluating the situation and ignoring the concept that these 2 things can coexist is what makes this separation so evident. It is not science nor faith, respectively, that creates this division, but rather the people who are too afraid to address the matter. If we were to look deeper into faith and science, we would see that they are not 2 mutually exclusive entities, but instead counterparts of a greater reality. Without one, the other is limited. As we know, science is proven in the scientific world, but even with the capacity and knowledge that research has given us, we heavily rely on the faith of that knowledge. As humans, what are we so sure of? I may be speaking for myself, but I don't know if we can be so sure about anything. We may have research, we may scientifically prove things, but by what standard is that proof reality? We must have faith that the things we study and observe are real, and that our knowledge is true. Both science and faith are rooted in the attempt to explain things that we do not understand. Let's take the example of humankind, for example. In the Bible, we are taught that God made man out of clay and later formed a woman out of the rib of that man. That strict interpretation of the Bible and the idea of evolution are 2 ideas that so obviously contradict one another. But if we were to look at an evolutionary standpoint, we can trace back to the farthest thing in our history, to Adam. Even that, though, is based wholly in faith. Where did that initial Adam come from? And if we cannot see that Adam, how do we know that it is there? How can millions of invisible things combine to form one larger thing? it's faith. In science, we make assumptions and predictions based on experience. If I were to let go of this microphone, it would most likely fall out of my hand and onto the table. I'm assuming this because in past experiences, this microphone has fallen every time I've let go of it. But that is merely a theory or a faith statement. I have no way of knowing that on the 100th time of letting go, this microphone will fall out of my hand. For science to even become relevant in our society, we must first have faith that the teachings, observations, and studies are truly reality. On the other hand, to have faith, there must be something that we base this faith on. We do not blindly believe in things that we have never experienced, whether solely in our minds or otherwise. Though our faith in God may seem so abstract, we have science, which proves part of our world, and that we have an inexplicable universe. Investigations and studies have proven so much, and that only leads to a greater conclusion that there must be a greater being that created it all. Even many of the most learned scientists have strong cores of religious faith. They know much about where things come from, but being surrounded by so many ambiguous and unknown factors makes them believe in a higher power. To sum it up in one statement, we must have faith that the logic is the determiner of reality.
There are two aspects of science and scientific thinking that I love. I love the logic of it. In science, you have a hypothesis, you design an experiment to test the hypothesis, and then based on the data you obtain, you conclude whether the hypothesis is supported or not supported. Often you determine that more testing is needed. The other aspect of science that I love is the anticipation of the results. That aha moment when you find out if what you thought would happen actually happens. So scientists need evidence to determine whether a certain theory is acceptable in describing a trend or event. The results need to be reproducible and carefully analyzed to stand the test of time. So where does faith, which is difficult to test, fit in with those who like to depend on hard facts and data? My journey of faith began with my mother. My mother is the most faithful person I know. Every Sunday she would wait at 7:30 a.m. for me to drive her to the 9 a.m. Mass, and we only lived 5 minutes away from church. I would ask her why she had to get to Mass so early, and she would always reply, "Don't you think God likes it when we're there early?" So she would attend the 9 a.m. Mass, sing in the choir at the 10:30 a.m. Mass, attend the Mass at noon, and then once a month she would enjoy the afternoon Italian Mass. My mother lives her life around worship, Mass, and prayer. She studies the saints and usually knows the saint of the day. And of course she loves that I teach at Sacred Heart. I have always been impressed by my mother's faith. Her beliefs led me to stories about faith and experiences with the afterlife. Although there is no hard evidence attached to these stories, they always seem so powerful and real. There are two stories that come to mind that I will briefly share with you. In the book, Waking Up in Heaven, the author, Crystal McVeigh, had a vivid experience of meeting God after she basically died during a medical procedure. She loved meeting God so much that she did not want to come back to Earth, even though she had a loving family that included a husband and several children. She said that God wanted her to come back to Earth, however, so that she could spread His word and teach others that heaven is real. In the second story, Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon, describes his experience with the afterlife in a book titled Proof of Heaven. Since he is a man of science, he includes the science behind his experience with the afterlife. The doctor's story began with an intense headache, and soon after, his entire cortex, the part of the brain that controls thought and emotion, had completely shut down. After 7 days in a coma, something very profound occurred, and it gave him a scientific reason to believe in consciousness after death. I would leave it to you to read his book to learn of his experience, but basically he concluded that death is not the end, but rather the beginning of a vast and positive journey. His knowledge of science adds an interesting twist, since he believes that the neurons of his inactive cortex could not be responsible for what he experienced. But back to my mother, Catherine. Catherine turned 86 this past May, and I began to realize that she was not as lively as she once was. I typically devoted my summers to professional development, but this past summer I decided to devote it to my mother. We would have time to pray together, to drink coffee, which we love, to laugh, and to simply just be together. On the evening of June 13th, I was finishing my last school assignment of the year. My mother, who has lived with me for the past 5 or so years, sat down at the dining room table as I worked and asked me about the saint of the day. She had forgotten who it was and asked me to look it up. I told her that I was busy at the moment, but starting tomorrow, June 14th, school would officially be over and our summer together would begin. I would have plenty of time to look up the saint of the day. She replied, "All right, good night." These are the last words that my mother will likely ever say to me. The next day, my mother had a life-altering, debilitating stroke. She could no longer speak, walk, or swallow. The summer fun that I was planning for us was quickly replaced by the emergency room, hospital stays, nursing homes, feeding tubes, and worst of all, silence. Why, God, I asked, why did you allow this to happen? I was going to spend the summer with my mother, and now this. We did not even have one day of summer fun. Whenever I let someone know that I've asked God this question, the response is always, God made sure that you had the time to be with your mother in her time of need, when she needed you most. So it has been a difficult journey, and my mother still cannot speak and is in relatively poor health. I know, however, that she would want me to keep believing, to keep having faith. And I do have faith. It's not the scientist in me that can make sense of it, but rather the person with experiences, relationships, and a sense of humanity that can confidently believe without the hard data to support the hypothesis. It may not be logical, but it makes perfect sense to me.
One of our first assignments for the senior seminar class was to listen to the Krista Tippett podcast about the balance between faith and reasoning. In this podcast, and actually Mr. Martin touched upon this a couple minutes ago, we learned that science and reasoning answer the how questions, while faith and religion answer the why questions. But is there ever a case where one can be understood independently of the other? I don't think we can say that science and religion are mutually exclusive in all respects. That is to say, to understand certain things, we need to take into account both science and religion. But there is a limit as to what science can explain, and at some point we must rely solely on our faith. I want to walk through an example, and this has been touched on, but I'll walk through it anyway, about the Big Bang Theory. So, where did we as a human species come from? Well, you might say we evolved from a former species. Okay, so where did that earlier species come from? And the answer would be from a simpler form of life. And where did the first life form come from? And then you might give me an explanation of how the lack of oxygen in the earlier Earth atmosphere allowed inanimate molecules to give way to cells and to other life forms. And how the inanimate molecules, each one that made up our planet and, in fact, the rest of the universe, all exploded from one tiny particle in what we know as the Big Bang. The end, you might say. No need for Adam and Eve, no need for the 7-day creation story. No need for God. But as science leads us to look at one tiny particle for the creation of the universe, it only makes sense to ask, where did that tiny particle come from? Science has no even nearly adequate explanation for this, and so it leads us out of the concrete world of science and into a place where only faith can offer us understanding. Up to a point, science and religion can go hand in hand and can complement each other rather nicely. But there comes a point when faith becomes essential in our understanding of this world. In our senior seminar course, as we delve into the world of quantum mechanics, it is evident that science can only explain so much, and we must go beyond our understandings of the physical world to be able to comprehend the way in which the world works. Faith in a higher power is certainly a part of it, but more generally, a faith in what we cannot know is crucial for a complete understanding of this world. So yes, faith is essential to our understanding of science, but are science and reasoning absolutely essential to our faith? Can faith such as this ever exist on its own without a previous understanding of reason and science? Theoretically, I think so. I agree with Descartes' explanation of the existence of faith. Through his statement, I think, therefore I am, he claims that the only thing we can believe in full confidence exists is our own mind. And knowing that our own mind somehow must have come into existence, we also must have confidence in the existence of a higher power which created that mind. Denying the existence of anything pertaining to science and reason, we can still have that assurance, that faith in a higher power. Although it is possible to have faith without a background in reason, our lives very naturally use both and require faith for a full understanding of this
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for being part of a great panel. My hope is just to begin to thread all the thoughts here that you've heard from the seven of us, and then to sort of segue into your questions. I think what you see represented here is a bit of a holistic approach to understanding faith and reason, science and theology. My hope is that you walk away with what Christina said, brave enough to enter the debate. Because none of us presume on the panel to have all the answers. The decades and the millennia of people who have come before us, they neither have the answers. We don't have the answers. But I think what Christina teed up for us as an opportunity, as a takeaway, is the courage and the stamina to enter into the debate. I think the thought I'd like to share with you is, for me, in my journey of understanding the complementarity and the differences between faith and reason, or science and theology, is clearly that it's not one or the other. It's not either or. It's not black and white. We are not divided in ourselves, nor is this argument or this debate able to be divided. So instead of either or, I would hope you take away the idea that it is both and. A simple way to sort of summarize the debate that has gone on before us and will continue to go on. Another great image that came from the panel was the idea of, we understand physically why things happen. Science can tell us the how. And as I was reflecting on some of my thoughts today, I would talk a little bit about the birth of my own children. We in biology and science can understand how children are born and the glory of human life. But sometimes the birth of a child moves people beyond the how and moves them to understand the divine, that God is present, somehow mysteriously. Parent after parent have talked about one of the most significant events in their lives is the birth of their children. For me, that becomes an image to talk a little bit about faith and reason, because we can understand how it happens. And yet that incredible epiphany, that Greek word which means, God being manifest, happens at the birth of children. So there, for me, is a symbolic way of understanding the debate of faith and reason. That it's not one way or the other, that we just have the courage to enter into the debate of understanding how God has infused God's self in our natural world.
The panel, what I would like to do is invite questions from the audience. I do have a handheld mic here, so I'll bring this down, or you can run up to the podium and ask your question from there. So please direct your question to a specific person or persons. I'm not sure if this is on. It is on. Yes.
So Mr. Martone and Tara, you guys both talked about the difference of how religion can explain the why and science can explain the how. Then what would be the purpose of something like the creation story in the Bible, which is so found like such an important part of our faith, but if religion isn't supposed to explain the why, then why do we even include that in our Bible?
Excellent question. I think that's where interpretation of the Bible comes from. Always, that we're always trying to get beyond the particulars, which often we read things today and we might want to look to. We ask questions of texts that are pertinent to that text. You look at a phone book to find a phone number. You look at a math textbook to learn about math. You read the Bible, I would say, to understand something about meaning. If I was saying, it's about meaning and the why, then we're looking, I guess, beyond the particulars, I would say, of how something happened to what is underlying the text. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, if you recall from freshman year, or maybe even this year, I think we might have talked about the vast difference in the representations of God and of humanity. How to keep the two, which are seem so different and contradictory, together. And we might say it's paradoxical, it's mystery, it's the unknown. But I don't know. I would say something like that. That we're getting to know something about God and ourselves beyond the particulars of how.
sorry?
This might go over.
Is that enough?
Okay. I'll use this one. I think there's kind of two, like Mr. Martin was saying, I definitely agree with, but I think there's kind of two different answers to that question. The first being that the authors of the Bible obviously were human and had like a natural human curiosity, and they didn't have as scientific or as extensive as a scientific background as we have today. So I think they too were looking for answers. They weren't just going to say, God created this world because he loved us. Like they were going to have to explain it somehow. So I think that's a part of it. I think also with the less literal interpretation of the Bible, I think those two stories are kind of meant to show us both in the 7-day creation story, I think that's meant to show us sort of how powerful God is and how loving he is to have created such a world. So I think that's kind of the purpose of those stories.
Thank you.
I would just add, if I could, just the whole idea of the East versus West understanding of reality, gets demonstrated in those creation stories. The video that we all watched beforehand showed, I think, an insatiable drive for perfection, for discovery. That's no different for those who wrote and discovered the books of Genesis. I think it represents for us this drive to understand things. I think we in the West have superimposed maybe more of a very scientific mind on the book of Genesis. Someone from the East would read it and understand that it's full of symbolism, it has truth, never meant to be a science book. I think that's a little bit of the casualty of the scientific mind of the West.
This is for, I guess, everyone. Danae touched a little bit on atheism, but most of you guys talked about how science and religion complement each other. So would you think that atheists are missing out on a part of life, or just that they're experiencing a different kind of life?
I wouldn't say that they're missing out on any part of life because you don't know what you're missing out on unless you know you're missing out on it. So if they don't know a life of having faith in God, then they're not really missing out on anything. They're just living their lives the way that they feel works for them. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I mean?
This might be like a short answer, but I think I kind of interpreted it as not only a faith in God, but a faith just in the science that we have. So atheists, even if they're looking at just a scientific standpoint, they have faith that that science is true. So even if they're not thinking about it from a God perspective, they're still having faith in something. They're having faith that science is how the world works.
The only other thing I would just add in closing for that conversation would be the idea of, for me as a faith-filled person, I think you got a sense of, from the panelists, many of us talked a little bit about faith gives us a context. And some of us may have hinted on the life of suffering. And if we've experienced suffering, or we will experience suffering, faith gives us that context. I could understand why the body may suffer physically if I have a heart attack. I can understand it anatomically and physically, and then we may move into emotionally. But without any sort of larger context that faith can give for suffering, I'm not sure how an atheist makes sense of it. What meaning does an atheist give to suffering?
Okay. Well, this is a question directed at Dr. Landry and Ms. Mussolino. Have you ever, in your work, noticed that people who have a faith in a certain religion work differently than people who deny the existence of God?
Well, I have only ever taught at Sacred Heart, so I find that many of the girls are very faithful, and I find that they work very hard, and I find that their faith really enriches the classroom experience, and I can't think of a specific example now, but I will try to think of that. But I find that just having that really well-rounded experience really does seem to enrich the classroom and enrich their understanding of things, and they look at things from different perspectives. I find And if I can just go back to that atheist question, because one thing that's really interesting is that book that I mentioned by the neurosurgeon who, before his experience, he really didn't have the context to believe, to have faith. He was more a man of science who, didn't think that, he didn't believe as much as he noticed some of his patients, had a strong sense of faith. And then after that, he seems like a much, he's very happy that he had that experience that he did, and now he is definitely a very faithful person, and he seems much happier, and he feels that he was missing out before when he did not have the belief in God that he has now.
So I would say that if your question is about how people of different faiths would perform research, for example, doing science, in my experience, I'm a chemist, so the materials that I would work with are not alive, and I don't think there's particularly large number of ethical questions that I came across, so the people that I worked with, there was no effect. But I think that question becomes really interesting when the study involves humans, or it could have important impacts in that realm. It could certainly dictate what a given person is interested in studying. If they're motivated by purely doing fundamental research, purely understanding the universe, versus more applied research trying to find the cure for something because they're motivated by a personal experience. So I think it's variable, and it depends on the research. And I would guess that there probably is an impact if we could do a study on it.
Is it okay if I respond to Mr. Baber's comment on atheists and how they experience suffering?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that kind of just shows that there are so many different places for us to find faith. And I think an atheist who doesn't turn to God the way that we do would be able to explore those different places more than we can. I mean, there's astrology and like your horoscope that atheists may use to describe their suffering and how they're feeling at the moment. And if something good happens to us, we would say thank God, but you hear other people say, I thank my lucky stars, instead of thanking God, because they have such a strong faith in science and other people being able to provide answers for them rather than having to turn to God or the Bible or religion and faith, not faith, or religion and faith.
But I have to go to the other side because we have time for maybe one more. And okay, far forward, other side.
I think Mr. Baber and Mr. Martone both kind of touched on meaning and giving context to reason, sort of. But my question, I guess, would be in line with kind of Danae's argument about faith being able to stand alone. Do you think that faith can have meaning without science? Or is it kind of the combination of the two that creates the meaning? Like, how would you define sort of the meaning that you're talking about? And like, can it exist in one realm or the other? Does it have to kind of be the intertwining of them both?
My intuitive answer is that faith really does need science. The history of the church has shown that faith without science or reason or logic or some of the structures that good thinking gives to faith, it can spin off into superstition. And that's dangerous. And we know that from history. Certainly the Catholic Church has been evidence of that danger. At times throughout the Catholic Church history, we have gone far astray from anything that makes logical sense. So I think the structures of logic and good thinking and authentic discernment have actually purified faith.
Can I just say one thing about Colleen's question? If you were asking if sometimes if a student's faith interferes with the study of science, something like embryonic stem cell research would come up. And one thing that I think that scientists are aware of those controversies and try to move forward with science so that it's advancing science so that those controversies don't exist. And I think one example is that now stem cells can be created without the use of embryos. So that's something that helps moving forward.
I guess I'd say it depends on the person, which means that I don't think that they are both essential to go together. As I was thinking about it, it begins in wonder, and I think we can. Wonder implies reason, but to the extent that we wish to apply reason, that's the extent to which we have wonder, and therefore, I don't know how to answer it. It depends so much on the person's openness to wonder, to being in awe. Fear of the Lord, as it says in the Bible, right? That's the beginning of being wise, to be in awe of God. That's why the reason and faith are inextricably linked in my mind. I don't know how it developed. It would have the science aspect would have to be. Let's begin with that.
Thank you very much. Wonderful panel. Let's give them certainly leaving with the idea of wonder is not such a bad idea. Wonder is one of those childlike things that we often forget about as we get older, but we shouldn't. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.